So, Berto, you know that when patrons write in, we usually give their emails preference over the lowly non-patrons, right?
I did not know that. I
Yeah.
thought that we gave preference to randos.
No randos, patrons only. If we get all the patron emails answered, then I start going to the listener. But the patron email list is so long.
You could never get.
Unless a listener writes in a particularly poignant email, which happens from now and then.
It's funny. In my head, I was hearing poignant, and that's exactly the word you used.
We're in sync. So we have an email from patron Karen that I want to talk about today. She has questions about how we make the podcast, so I thought we'd do that today. What do you say?
I think that's a brilliant idea.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Who are you, Berto?
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I am a traffic planner for the city of Seattle.
Patron Karen writes, "Hey, Kirk, I think it would be really cool if you did a podcast about your process with making these podcasts. I want to know if you have a thought about an idea and complete it fairly quickly, or maybe have several ideas going at once." Berto, what do you think the answer to that one is?
First of all, the topic is meta. Maybe we could even do a podcast about planning a podcast about how we do the podcast.
Yeah.
But you usually have a multitude of potential ideas.
Yeah.
And
I've been keeping track. I mean, we've been doing the podcast since late 2008, so it's almost 9 years.
It's crazy.
And since then, this list has just been growing and growing and growing. And when I run out of ideas, which is rare, I'll go to that list and I'll just look at it, and I'm just like, oh my God.
Because you would have thought at first, like, well, how many topics could we do?
There's so many things to talk about. So many. I mean, there are times when I come across a research article and I was like, I want to make like 5 episodes just about this one research article.
Right.
And that happens regularly.
Right.
I'm writing a book on supervision, and I have reviewed probably thousands of research studies on supervision.
Like 2010?
2010?
Like people that can see really well?
I get it. What is it? I don't even know what it has to do with 2010.
Supervision.
Yeah.
Like, 2020.
Yeah.
2010 is even better.
We need to have a name for that kind of joke when you say something and you pretty much know I'm not going to get it. And then you just stare at me.
A hanger. What was a hanger?
This is called a Berto joke. Because
joke.
you do this all the time. You say a joke, and I know you're smart enough to know that I'm probably not going to get it because it's so random.
Well, that's part of my fun that I have secretly is, okay, how can I make a comment that will be just sound random enough to where people could think it's just a random comment, but it's got a thread in there.
But which I'll get into more later in terms of having to manage other people on the podcast. Silence in a podcast is the worst thing you could have.
But there's no silence because see, all the podcast listeners are laughing raucously and hysterically during that pause, so they don't miss the pause.
Yeah,
or they miss the pause.
So I like if you want to say a terrible joke that's just like on its face terrible, I would much rather have you do that and have me go like that's a stupid joke than say something that it's so deadpan I don't even know you're joking.
That's you're killing the comedy.
Let's do it again where I actually react in the real world, and I'll have the listeners listen to what it would actually sound like without me like having a mini freak out in the zone. So I wrote a book on supervision.
Oh, do you mean 2010?
Don't laugh because you don't laugh.
Shit. Okay.
I'm writing a book on supervision.
Oh, like 2010? Sorry.
I listen to podcasts, and when they go silent, unless I know like, oh, they're going silent for some kind of
negative
purpose.
Space, man.
Negative space is awesome in visual art because you're looking at something. In silence, you think your phone has died, and that's it's like not good for people. Okay, so yeah, you ask patron Karen, you want to know about topics, and yeah, and how long it takes to prepare. I think I want to know if you have a thought about an idea and complete it fairly quickly, or maybe have several ideas going at once. Well, it depends. Some topics I do very quickly. Like I just read your email just now and made some notes about how to respond, but some times I have an idea. I have ideas that I sometimes resurrect from a list that I jotted down 7 years ago.
Yeah.
Things that I've just been dying to talk about. Like I want to do an episode. I did an episode recently on Donald Winnicott, and I've been wanting to do a deep dive on him for a long time. Or I want to do a deep dive on Carl Rogers. I want to do a deep dive on Whitaker and Satir, and there's all these people that I want to do, and have been intending on doing, but there's so many other topics to do.
Right. And the world keeps on moving. Stuff happens all the time. Many things happen which we want to talk about because they have some sort of psychological significance.
Right. Exactly. There's things that happen in the news and blah, blah, blah. And, patrons email us and whatnot. So, on the other hand, so you're also kind of asking about how long it takes to prep, and I'll tell you that some episodes take very little time to prep for. But as time has gone on and patrons have signed up, it's justified me spending more of my time preparing for the podcast to make better podcasts, really.
Right.
Even like kind of throwaway podcasts that you and I do, like about Black Mirror or something, I spend probably 20 hours prepping for it. I watch all the episodes again. I take notes. I look up the actors and, compile all these lists. And
because if you were going to, a topic comes up, you might have a vision for what you want to say about it. But if you really do your research, you could have a super vision about it.
Like 2010?
What?
You blew it. You're supposed to just have silence.
Oh, damn it.
Most topics that seem like they take time take a lot of time. The Game of Thrones episodes, even the Black Mirror episodes, Donald Winnicott, EMDR, etc. These episodes can take anywhere from 8 hours to 80 hours, maybe even longer for me to prepare for. And I do this during my free time after work from my work at the university or after work in my private practice. But it's fun for me to do. It's creative. I enjoy learning about these things. And the patrons make it worth my time. She goes on here, do you strive to work a certain number of hours a day on the podcast or just go with making one whenever you have time? I will tell you that I make one whenever I have the time because my weeks are so random. Some weeks my work is very busy and some weeks they aren't. And I have, I'm writing a book about 2010 and there's lots of different things I'm doing. And so this is what I do when I don't have anything else that I need to do, right? Like there's a lot of things in my life I have to do, right? I have to edit out silences that Berto causes on the podcast.
You have to pay the bills.
Yeah. And so this is what I do extra, and that's always the way it's been. I've always been working, and sometimes people who listen to the podcast will know that I'll be recording the podcast at midnight or 1 a.m. because that's because usually in that situation, I will have been preparing for it for several hours prior, and then I'm like, well, if I go to bed, wake up, go to work, get home, do some chores, maybe I'll have time and all the thinking will go away.
Right. You'll have to reboot your brain.
Right. And so I might as well just do it now when my brain is, has it all crammed in there and sacrifice the fact that I'm about to pass out. She also asked, do you hire anyone to do your research or do you do it all yourself? I find this to be the most preposterous question. I do it all by myself. I don't think I could hire someone because as I research the topic, as I was saying before, I become aware of the landscape and all the nuances involved in that topic. If someone just handed me a summary, I would probably sound like someone who was reading a summary instead of someone who really knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, it's like when you have a reporter who did the research and wrote the report versus someone reporting on the report.
Right.
Yeah.
If you just read from a report, then it comes across in a very different way. And I can tell podcasts that are doing that, and I hate it. I like listening to podcasts and reading reading writings from writers,
Yeah.
from people that you can tell like their knowledge is deep, and they're just telling you the cliff notes of what they know.
Because if you try to dig any deeper, I mean, your knowledge only extends to what that summary would be.
Right, exactly. Another question, patron Karen asks, do you wait to be inspired, or do you think inspiration comes while you're working? As I was saying earlier, I'm inspired all the time, probably too often. There are so many topics and not enough time. Sometimes I fantasize about locking myself in a room for like 3 months and just banging out like 1,000 episodes so I can get all of, because I'm a list maker and I like to cross things off my list. And I have a lot of things on my list with this. In fact, my to-do list because I've been pretty good about getting rid of a lot of things on my to-do list. But I would say 95% of the things on my to-do list have to do with the podcast.
Wow.
She also asked, do you brief guests much on the episode of the podcast beforehand? That's a good question. Do we brief the guests before they come on? And the answer is no. I never brief the guests, but I should. I just don't have the time, I think, or the professionalism, or really even the times where I've done briefings of guests. It doesn't seem to make any effect.
Right.
Some guests just have no idea how to be on a podcast. They come on the podcast and they stammer, and they're either completely freaking out, or they just don't know what they came here to do. It's like they reached out to me to be on a podcast, and then they just sort of show up.
The idea sounded good.
And then I ask them questions, and they're like, well, I don't know. And you've been there.
Oh, yes. Where it feels like we are the ones asking them to talk about their topic.
Right. It like if someone just came into the room and listened for a few minutes, they would have assumed we just grabbed someone off the street and forced them into a podcast.
I don't really want to do this.
Yeah. But I do actually try to prep people in ways like people are, especially new people to podcasting, are almost always anxious. I was extremely anxious for the first number of months whenever we turn on the recorder. And so I can relate to that, and I can see when people are freaking out. I've had people who there's something about a microphone too that I think freaks people out. And I've had people who have been on the radio, on TV, and police officers who obviously have been through a lot of stress, and they come on the podcast and their adrenaline starts to pump. There's just something about a microphone being shoved in your face and then having to talk off the cuff,
Right. And it's different than if you have been in settings where you have one of those little clip-on mics, those you can sort of forget about.
Right.
You can't forget about this thing.
These mics are, and I always put them as close as I can to their face,
right?
Because it provides the best audio quality. I also try to help them understand how to use a microphone. That usually takes a lot of time. So I have a spiel that I tell everyone because. What do you
think are some of the problems with the microphone?
Yeah. See, so Berto was just like a foot away from the mic, and that's the quality difference. It's so even just a few inches away from the mic, it's a drastic drop off in quality. Her last question here from patron Karen is, have you ever just posted a podcast without listening to it back? The answer is yes. But for the first 6 or 7 years, I edited each episode word by word, which meant I had to slowly listen back to each episode about 10 to 20 times. And especially when we had more than 2 people, like we would have 4 people, there's 4 audio tracks. And sometimes people talk over each other. And so I'd have to like cut out one person's track. And so it if an episode was, say, an hour, which is like a typical length, it probably took me about 10 to 20 hours to edit that 1 hour episode. In the end, I don't do this anymore, but in the end, as I was doing this, I actually developed a sort of exercise routine to do while I was editing, where I would run in place next to my computer because there are times like the final time I would listen back to it, I wasn't doing a lot of interacting with the file. And so I could sort of jog in place to like at least get some kind of exercise. You know? But lately, I have finally developed enough skill as a podcast host to not require editing, which is a wonderful thing. For instance, this episode, we've been talking this whole time, and I'm guessing I'm not going to edit anything out, even the argument that we had about the 2010 joke. Now, back in the day, I would have said something stupid, or it would have gone too far, and I would have taken it out. And then once I took that out, then I'd have to take out every other reference to 2010. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But yeah, lately I've developed enough skill as a podcaster to not require editing. And there are a lot of skills that I've learned that you need as a podcaster to not have to, or just in general, there's just a lot of skills. What kind of skills have you developed, or you think I've developed over the years?
Well, I was going to say, like, for example, especially when it's just the two of us, over the years, I have intuitively mostly developed the ability to just not talk about things I don't want to talk about. And every now and then I'll slip up, and, but it's not that frequent.
What do you mean? You what are you saying?
Like about things that I don't want to talk about myself, or topics that I don't want to really go into. Like, I think initially I would maybe venture down more paths that either you or I were not comfortable with. And then over the years, I was just like, I just found more of a playground within which I can operate fairly safely.
Like politics or religion.
Or even personal details. Like at some point, I know every now and then I'll say something that I don't really, because it's a very public forum.
Yeah.
And so I only want to talk about, all my preferences with sexuality and all my hang-ups and all my history.
Yeah.
But there's things like, what size shoe I wear that I just don't want to discuss.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then the other thing is, you and I have done this so many times that we sort of have an automatic back and forth.
Yeah.
When there's other guests involved, then it starts, and then the more guests and the more they're less, or the less used they are to podcasts, that's where it starts getting a little trickier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've actually learned over time that when it's you and me, things go very smoothly. Whenever we add other people, or when I'm with other people and you're not here, things are much less smooth. And so you and I have developed a rhythm, and we understand where you it's like I'm leading, and I'm reading my notes, and then when to chime in and for how. When I was writing in my notes about this, I knew I predicted that exact thing. I also learned to speak quickly and clearly. I come from a family of slurs.
Slurs.
My mom and my dad are both are not very articulate. I mean, they're smart people, but they kind of slur their words. We don't come from a bunch of fast New York talkers.
Yeah.
We come from a bunch of slow talkers, and that doesn't work as well as speaking quickly and clearly.
Well, when I was first performing music in public many, many years ago, I had not started, or I was just starting to take voice lessons or something. And I remember I did a little open mic with my guitar, and afterwards I went up to my friend and I'm like, hey, how did it sound? And he was like, well, I couldn't understand almost any word you said. And I'm like, really? And then I think I had recorded, or I heard it back. I'm like, oh man, I'm slurring everything. And then when I was starting to take voice lessons, that was one of the first things I worked on, because I thought I was pronouncing things, but I wasn't. I was saying, well, like this, man, like.
Well, the funny thing is when it comes to singing and art, like there are plenty of singers that no one understands what they're saying.
Yeah,
and
that's still true. And I guess
great.
If you don't mind, or even if it's intentional, but I actually wanted people to hear my lyrics. So.
Also, I have to refrain from saying anything stupid, which took me years to learn how to do. There's so many things that pop into your head when you're doing a podcast that you would say in a casual conversation that should not be on a podcast. It obviously, big things like like personal issues or some kind of, but also just other like tangents that you might go on. When you're doing a podcast, you need to stay on track essentially. Otherwise, people, when I listen to podcasts where they don't stay on track, it drives me crazy. I also have to catch any audio problem and address it before the recording starts. So if someone is breathing or hitting the microphone or
buzzes
there's some kind of buzz in the equipment, I have to address that before, which requires me to just almost unconsciously pick up on things before we start recording.
Right.
Whereas before, I wouldn't pick up on things, and then I would record the whole thing, or I'd notice like halfway through the podcast that we had a buzz, and I'd be like too nervous to stop or something. There's just all these, there's all these things running around in your head. And I remember that actually when we did the podcast for the first 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
At the end of recording a podcast episode, I would be so tired. My brain would be so tired because it was working on 1,000 different tasks at once.
Right.
Whereas now it's so automatic to me that I still get fatigued when we record. Like the Black Mirror episode was
that was long.
4 hours long.
Was it?
I think so. Yeah. I have to notice any moment that should be edited and make a mental note to go back and edit that part instead of listening back to the whole file. I have to go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, do you remember the episode with Lita? It was one of the early video ones, and we were standing, but there was some like construction going on.
Oh, yeah.
And it was so loud, and the audio was terrible.
Yeah. It was on Queen Anne, and there was construction, and I had to EQ that to this just narrow band, and it sounded like we were talking through like a little tube. I also have to make sure I'm super prepared so the episode doesn't drift off into something stupid. I also, as I was talking about earlier, have to manage other people on the podcast, like Berto. I might have to interrupt someone if they're going on a long tangent. Berto doesn't do that ever, but other people do. I might have to remind them that we're talking on the internet and that everything we say will be broadcast to literally everyone who has an internet connection. Because sometimes people say stuff and I'm like, are you sure you want that on the internet?
Right.
And so I have to manage that. And as I have in my notes here, I might have to jump in when someone pauses. Because some people do that too. So when you make a 2010 Berto joke, then you're trying to pause, but some people actually pause a lot when they talk
because they're trying to think. They're trying to
And when you're in the room with them, it you don't even notice it.
Right.
But when you're listening to a podcast and there's just dead space, it will drive you crazy. There's something about an audio medium that just abhors silence.
Because you ask them like, so what happened then?
And then it's like, well.
I was.
No, it's longer than that. I mean, it's weird. Like it. You and I don't do that because we've learned not to do that, and we're just generally not those kinds of people. Well, I kind of am. I'm kind of a pauser.
Well, it's funny. I've learned to be a pauser. For example, at work and stuff, because all my life I was you ask me a question, I'm already answering before you finish the question, and I had to learn to okay, let me think a little bit before I start answering. Which is sort of the opposite that you want in the podcast.
Well, you slowing down means you're probably on a normal pace. I mean, at least on the podcast, you're on a normal
that's
pace.
fair.
But yeah, I mean, pausing in speech is better than going right. Just pause. It's fine to pause. I also have to monitor time and figure out a way to wrap things up at the end. For instance, I have a big clock that I'm watching to kind of time things because we now have breaks with ads in them and stuff. So I have to keep track of that, which is kind of difficult sometimes, and I sometimes mess up. I also have to monitor the mood of the other people on the podcast because if people get squirrely, the podcast will go off the rails, which happens sometimes. And, Berto, you've been there for moments like that.
Oh, yes.
Someone will get hurt or angry or despondent or just non-responsive. And then they just drag the podcast down a hole. And I need to learn how to prevent that from happening because it's so awkward and you can hear it on the podcast.
We haven't ever made someone cry. We need to do that.
Are you
call
sure?
Someone in here, like on purpose, like breaking them down till they're bawling, and we got to do it.
Yeah. I also have to be non-sleep deprived and well-fed and well-hydrated and empty bladdered,
like a pet.
There's just a lot of things that you have to do that I've learned over the years that I have to do as a podcaster. But mostly, you just have to get used to doing podcasts. It's something that I just feel it in my bones that now I'm way more comfortable than I was, say, 5 years ago.
You feel it in your fingers.
And I've never been a talk off the cuffer. In my family, I was one of the younger kids. I have two extroverted older siblings, and they were a lot older, like 6 years older, 7 years older. And so I was the young little kid who didn't talk, who was in his own world, playing with his Legos and making up his stories in his head and completely like independent, right? And so I never really was verbal. And whenever I had to give a speech or read in front of the class as a kid, it would completely freak me out.
Really?
Oh, yeah. You didn't know that about me?
I didn't know that, no.
That's one of the defining features of my childhood. I can remember specific times going back to like the first grade of having just to read like a sentence in front of the class and just losing my crap.
I never knew that because ever since I've known you, I've never thought, you've always been, someone that would start a conversation, would approach others.
No. I'm not talking about talking conversations. Yeah. I'm talking about like
presenting and.
Yeah. I'm talking about doing something formal or.
Well, and you play music though in front of people,
but music I can do because music has a structure to it or something. It has I don't improv usually, although we did play in an improv group for a while, and that was kind of interesting. But the issue is that when I get up on stage or I put up or a microphone, like let me give you an example. We've been in bands over the years, and whenever we would play, Chris Huber, the drummer in my band, he's great on a stage talking, but he's the drummer and he's in the back. And he would always yell at me, Kirk, talk to the crowd. I'm right up front. I'm the singer, and I'm the guitar player. I'm right there. And whenever the song, so I'd sing the song and I'd be screaming and jumping around. The song would end. And then Huber would be like, Kirk, say something. And I'd be like, every time I'd try to sort of mix it up, make a joke or comment on something. I could look out in the crowd and see everyone just kind of looking around like, what did he say?
What's going on?
Like what's happening? That's how bad I am, because I don't have that. I didn't have that skill, but now I do. And so being a professor actually has helped that, because when you're a professor and you're on stage in front of a bunch of people teaching, and the way Antioch is experiential, it's not lecture based.
Okay.
I have to interact and move when they present something. So I have to adjust, and I have to react,
So you've gained that skill over the years.
Right. And on the podcast, you just do this for 9 years.
Yeah.
And eventually your brain just learns how to to connect the dots in such a way that I can keep talking in a way that makes things at least halfway interesting.
Yeah.
Whereas before, I don't know if you remember when we first started doing the podcast, with this conversation right here, I wouldn't have been able to have.
Oh, wow. Yeah, because for me, I've had a little bit of a different path. I've always loved talking in front of people. But I have to say, though, when I started playing in bands, it's not that I didn't talk or want to talk, but my brain would definitely get shut down a little bit. So I would say something like, so everyone's doing, how's everyone tonight? Like it would get jumbled, like almost Yoda speak or something.
No offense, but you still are kind of like that when you're playing.
That could be, yeah.
You tend not to say much in between the songs, but when you do, it's not as free and charming as you are normally.
How's everyone back, the people?
Well, I know you well enough to know that you take your performances very seriously.
Yes.
And you have a lot of things to think about.
That's true.
You're playing the bass. Your bass lines are always like the most complex ever. You're the only singer, so you have that. You're trying to keep your voice within the range that it sounds good,
and not get too tired and all that. Yeah, totally. It's a lot of stuff too.
And I can tell when you're on stage, you're really concentrating on a lot of things. And then whenever you go to the mic to say, now I'm not saying I'm good at it. I feel like now that I have done so much public speaking in the last few years and the podcast and stuff, I wonder if I went back on stage, if I would be better. I'd do better banter in between.
It's interesting because, so first of all, you're right about all those things. And I also, it's not like I play daily, playing out. There was a period 10 years ago when I was playing a lot. Lately, it's a show every blue moon.
Right.
But when I do presentations, like for work, those I do all the time.
Yeah.
So those now I've gotten really natural and good at it. I'm really good at it. But it's still the mental process going through my head is, well, I prepared the slides. I know what I'm going to say.
Right.
So I am sort of in control of it.
Right.
And I don't have to be playing a bass or a guitar. I don't have to be doing all these other mental gymnastics.
Yeah, me too. When I'm prepared for a talk, I'm much better.
Yeah.
When I have to speak off the cuff. But I have to say I've gotten better. And I consider I'm a little proud of it because I was so terrible at it. I mean, I still am to some extent. Like there are still times when I'm called on to just talk off the cuff. Like, for instance, we're having graduation soon. This podcast might come out after graduation, but it's graduation time of year for my university. And I was going to have to give a speech to all the students. And as program director, and it's just sort of a random circumstance, but I was kind of sweating it a little bit, even though I knew exactly the gist of what I was going to say, and the pressure was pretty low because it's not a long speech. It's just like I probably just have to talk for like 30 seconds or something. And I could probably say almost nothing and no one would care, but I want to do it good, Well, I was sort of sweating it. And even though I'm a professor and I'm a podcaster and I'm program director and like I do these things all the time, but I was sweating it. Other people in my position would not be sweating it. They'd be like, oh yeah, that thing I'm doing later, And really, if I could think that way, it'd be better because if I just randomly started talking, I'd probably be much better than all the kind of, overthinking I do. And then recently it was decided that they're going to break everyone up into different groups. And so now I only have to do this for like 100 people or something.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like way more relaxed now for some reason.
That's good.
It was so bad. I was best man for Chris Glover's wedding. And I gave the best man speech. And I was stone cold sober, by the way, just a little detail. And I had been sweating this best man speech for so long that I was so nervous, and when I said it, I switched the words around to say that I wish they don't have a long life together.
Oh no!
And yeah, it was brutal. Like everyone just kind of said, like everyone was like, "What did he say?" And it came out all kind of garbled and weird. And,
oh no!
And I was, shaking, and I'm awful. Like I had it's man. So for me to be able to just even talk into a microphone. I feel good about it. It feels like a huge accomplishment, honestly.
That's great. I mean, I have to say that when I am presenting to a lot of people, it's actually easier for me.
Yeah.
Because I can just say what I came to say without
like 500 people, 1,000 people.
Oh, even 100 or more. But the difference is when I'm in a room with say 10 people. Sometimes, not all the time, sometimes it's much harder. And the reason is usually because there's one or more individuals that I know are very nitpicky about things. And they might be in a position of authority.
So they could interrupt you or something.
Or even if they're not interrupting me, I feel them judging my words.
Yeah. To close, I just want to talk about the different traumas I've been through regarding this. Because I don't remember a lot I remember a fair amount from my childhood, but the memories are limited, right?
Yeah.
The percentage of my childhood memories related to what we're talking about is probably like 1 out of 5 memories.
Wow.
I remember in this would have been the 7th grade. I gave a speech about tigers, I think. I remember around that time giving a speech about Switzerland that I was totally, and it was just like, go to the encyclopedia. What's the primary export of Switzerland? Where is it? What's the square miles? It was all on cue cards.
Yeah.
And I was completely freaking out. I remember, and the other thing was in my life, I've always got up on stage anyway, is the thing.
I see.
Like in high school, I ran for student government, even though I didn't care about student government. And I completely screwed up that speech. I won't even go. I think I've talked about it in the podcast before. There's just all these moments where I just completely... I volunteer to be on stage, and then I ruminate about it for 6 months and say, Kirk, don't ever do this again. This is terrible. This is terrifying.
But then you go into...
Yeah.
So like imagine being a comedian.
Yeah.
Where you're bombing sometimes.
I've actually thought about trying like 5 minutes of stand-up, try to get 5 minutes of jokes, essentially.
Because the difference between playing in a band is if you play in a band and you play music that they didn't quite care for or they weren't that excited for, they'll still politely clap anyways.
Or even if they don't clap, it's
okay. You can move on.
Silence is expected because you're so loud.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
But in a comedy club,
if no one laughs.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I actually even thought about this. I thought I would account for that fear by having a set that wasn't funny, you know what I mean? Like
I see.
Like it'd be more story based.
Norm Macdonald.
Yeah, just more kind of like long stories that are entertaining but not guffaw, because I don't feel like I'm a guffaw kind of person.
Right.
Anyway.
Okay.
Well, I hope that answers your question, patron Karen. Everyone, please take care of yourself out there because
you deserve it.